Welcome back to the deep dive. And I have to admit, looking at the table today, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed.
I can see why.
Usually, we have a book, maybe a couple of articles. But today, we are staring at a stack of sources covering, 72 specific scholarly inquiries? And they all circle back to just one person.
It is a massive amount of material. And honestly, that feeling of being overwhelmed is probably the correct reaction.
Okay.
Because when you start pulling out the threads of this specific figure, you aren't just reading a biography. You are effectively dismantling and rebuilding the entire structure of Islamic history.
We're talking about Aisha bin Abi Bakr. And the thing that struck me immediately is that she doesn't feel like a typical historical figure,
How so?
Well, usually history is this person was born, they fought a battle, they signed a treaty, they died.
Right.
But Aisha feels less like a person and more like I think one of the papers used the term hermeneutical key.
That is the perfect term for her. Hermeneutical key. She's the interpretive lens. You can't view Islamic law, you can't view theology, and you certainly can't understand early political history without looking through the lens of Aisha. She is, in a way, the gatekeeper.
And that seems to be the central problem, right? Because depending on which tradition you're standing in, that lens, it distorts the image in completely different ways.
Right, and the distortions are, they're violent.
We have sources here painting her as the mother of believers, the absolute pinnacle of legal authority. Then you shuffle the stack, and suddenly she's a politically compromised figure, or even an enemy of the faith.
And then you have the modern historians who are just trying to scrape away centuries of projection to find the actual woman underneath.
So our mission today is to navigate that divide. We're not here to act as a court of appeals for a 1,400-year-old case.
No, we're not going to say who's right. We want to understand why these narratives exist, because when you look at Aisha, you're looking at the fault lines of Islamic thought.
So let's jump right into the deep end. I want to start with the thing that jumped out at me first, mostly because it feels so contrary to the stereotype of, religious literature. The issue of privacy.
Or the lack of it.
The total lack of it. The paradox of privacy.
It's a huge tension in the sources.
It really is. I mean, you have the Quran, which has these very strict verses about modesty, about the screen or hijab. But then you open the hadith corpus,
The sayings and stories.
attributed to Aisha, and the volume of intimate narrations is, it's staggering. We're talking about very specific details about menstruation, ritual bathing, sexual intimacy.
It gets incredibly granular.
I mean, there are narrations about the Prophet kissing her while he was fasting. There's one about them bathing from a single vessel, their hands crossing in the water. This stuff, in almost any other culture, stays firmly behind a locked door.
Sure.
So why do we know this?
That is the question. And if you look at the Sunni scholarly tradition, especially someone like Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, they rely on a concept they call divine necessity.
Divine necessity. That sounds like a heavy lifting term.
It is. The argument is that the prophet wasn't just a leader. He was the walking, breathing embodiment of the law. His life wasn't just a biography, it was the source code for the Sharia.
And Sharia covers everything.
Everything. How you trade, yes, but also how you purify yourself and what happens in the bedroom.
So the logic is, if Aisha stays silent out of, bashfulness, the community loses access to half the law.
Precisely. The argument is the community needed to know. Without her, Muslims might have adopted extreme practices. For example, some cultures at the time would completely isolate menstruating women.
Right, the red tent idea, treating them as untouchable.
Exactly. But Aisha narrates that the prophet would recite the Quran with his head in her lap during her cycle. That one image just shatters the taboo. So in the Sunni view, the need to teach overrides personal modesty. She had to speak.
But that's not the only take on this, is it? Because the sources mention a pretty strong critique coming from the Shia tradition about these exact same stories.
That's right. And this is where the lens shifts. For many Shia scholars, these specific graphic narrations are viewed as khilafa murua. It's roughly undignified, or contrary to the code of honor. The argument is about the dignity of the prophet.
They feel it's almost disrespectful to him.
Yes, that these details would have been handled with more discretion if they came from, say, his daughter Fatima or his cousin Imam Ali. The critique even goes deeper.
How so?
Some Shia scholars suspect these might be later fabrications attributed to her to sort of humanize the prophet to an excessive degree, to lower his spiritual status and, by extension, the status of his family.
It's fascinating. The same text is legal necessity to one group and undignified exposure to another.
And then there's the modern sort of feminist angle.
Oh, absolutely. Scholars like Amina Wadud or Fatima Mernissi, they see a double-edged sword here.
Because on one hand, she's speaking, she's a central authority.
Right. These narrations prove women were absolutely central to early legal discourse. Aisha wasn't silent. But the critique is that this created what they call a gendered epistemology.
Which is a fancy way of saying
Women's bodies became objects of intense legal scrutiny. By cataloging every detail of her private life, it opened the door for centuries of male jurists to regulate women's bodies based on these texts. She spoke to empower, maybe, but the data was then used to regulate.
That's a complex legacy, and it actually segues perfectly into the next big chunk of our sources. We can't talk about Aisha without the sectarian split.
Right, and it's not just about succession, about who gets to be the boss. Reading this, it feels like the split fundamentally changes how history itself is recorded.
It changes the methodology of truth. It's not just who rules, it's who is telling the truth about the past.
So help us break down the difference. You have the science of men versus the loyalty filter.
Sure. In the Sunni tradition, they use al-riyal, the science of men. The core premise is that all the Sahaba, the companions, are considered udul, upright.
Trustworthy by default.
Exactly, and Aisha is at the absolute top of that pyramid. She has superiority of access. She was in the house, she saw things no one else saw. So if she says it, and the chain is solid, it's accepted.
But the Shia methodology just flips this on its head.
Completely. For them, the filter is loyalty to the al-Bayt, the Prophet's family, and this is where we have to talk about the elephant in the room.
The Battle of the Camel.
656 CE, you have Aisha leading an army against Imam Ali.
It's hard to overstate how big a deal that is. The Prophet's wife leading an army against the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law. It's civil war right inside the household.
It's the event that splits the narrative forever. For Sunnis, they have to do some theological triage. They say, okay, it was a mistake.
An error in ijtihad.
Yes, an error in independent legal reasoning. She thought she was doing the right thing, demanding justice for the murdered Caliph Uthman. She regretted it. But, and this is key, Sunnis say this political error does not invalidate her truthfulness as a narrator of religious law.
So she can be wrong about the war, but we still trust her on how to pray.
Exactly. Political error doesn't equal religious dishonesty. But for the Shia, this wasn't just a mistake, this was khuruj. Rebellion against the rightful imam. It creates political enmity. And in their methodology, if you have enmity toward the al-Bayt, your reliability as a religious source is compromised.
So they reject her narrations.
Especially the ones that seem to minimize Ali. And you see this tension play out perfectly in the deathbed controversy.
This was the most dramatic example for me. Two completely different descriptions of the Prophet's final moments.
It's like two different films. In the Sunni tradition, relying heavily on Aisha, the Prophet dies with his head in her lap. It's this moment of intimacy that cements her status and, by extension, validates her father, Abu Bakr.
In the Shia narrative.
He dies in Ali's arms. They reject Aisha's claim completely. They see it as a political story designed to bolster her father's legitimacy and sideline Ali at the most critical moment in history.
Incredible. The same room, but two contradictory historical facts.
And that's why she's the hermeneutical key. How you view that deathbed scene tells me everything about your theology.
But she wasn't just a political figure. Segment 3 of our notes highlights her as an intellectual, a critic.
The Aisha school. She was not afraid to correct the men around her. There's a specific term for this, al-istidrak, the correction.
I love the example of the dogs and women incident. It's so sharp.
It's iconic. So, a famous companion, Abu Huraira, narrated that a prayer is voided if a dog, a donkey, or a woman passes in front of the praying man.
Lumping women in with livestock. Nice.
Right. And Aisha hears this, and she doesn't just get angry, she dismantles it. She says, you have compared us to donkeys and dogs.
She calls out the dehumanization immediately.
But she doesn't stop at moral outrage. She brings the evidence. She clarifies that she herself used to lie in front of the Prophet like a corpse, were her words, while he prayed. She was right there, between him and the direction of prayer.
So she uses her own lived experience, her physical presence in the Prophet's private life, to overrule a legal ruling that was dehumanizing to women.
Exactly. It shows her independent intellectual authority. She wasn't just a tape recorder, she was analyzing, context-checking, and challenging interpretations in real time.
Now, things get even stranger when we get into theology. We've got magic and visions of God.
The theological deep ends. This is where the hadith literature bumps up against, well, abstract dogma.
Let's start with the vision of God. Did Muhammad see God?
A huge debate. Ibn Abbas, a great interpreter of the Quran, he affirmed a vision. But Aisha, she slammed the door on it. She said, "Whoever claims Muhammad saw his Lord has uttered a great lie."
A great lie. She doesn't mince words.
And she cites the Quran to back it up. No vision can grasp him. What's interesting is that Sunni theology largely sided with Aisha here, at least on physical vision. They use her to argue against anthropomorphism.
And then there's the magic. This one really surprised me. The idea that the prophet was bewitched.
This is one of the most controversial points for modern rationalists. The narrations say a man performed magic on the prophet.
And the symptoms were severe, right? Like imagining he had done things he hadn't actually done.
Yes. And you can see immediately why this is a problem. It threatens a prophetic infallibility.
Right. If he's imagining things, can we trust the revelation? If he thinks he did something he didn't, could he think he received a verse he didn't?
That's the rationalist critique. They reject it entirely because the Quran explicitly defends the prophet against accusations of being bewitched. But the traditional defense is more nuanced.
How do they square that circle?
They say, look, it was a bodily affliction, like a fever or a headache. It affected his body, maybe his perception of daily tasks, but it never touched his mind or his heart when it came to the revelation. That remained guarded.
It's a delicate needle to thread. Human enough to get sick, but protected enough to be a prophet.
Precisely.
Okay, we have to talk about the goat.
The goat. Or the sheep. The lost verses.
This sounds like an urban legend, but it's in the sources.
It is. Aisha narrated that there were verses on stoning and adult breastfeeding written on a sheet under her bed. And during the chaos of the prophet's funeral,
a domestic animal came in and ate it.
Yes.
I mean, the implications for the preservation of the Quran are massive. Critics must have a field day with this.
They do. Skeptics use this to argue against the idea of perfect preservation. They ask, if a goat can eat a verse, is the book we have today complete?
How does the Sunni tradition handle that? You can't just ignore it.
No, you can't. They explain it through the concept of nasht al-tilawa, abrogation of recitation.
Meaning?
The idea is that God intended for the text of that verse to be removed from the Quran. The legal ruling might remain, like stoning, but the words themselves were withdrawn. The goat, in this view, was just the physical means by which God's will was enacted.
That's a fascinating way to look at it. The goat as an agent of divine abrogation.
It connects back to the idea that the Quran is a living interaction, not just a static book dropped from the sky.
Before we wrap up, we have to touch on the controversy that seems to dominate every modern discussion about Aisha, her age.
The age controversy. It is the friction point between tradition and revisionism.
The standard narrative, the one in Sahih Bukhari, is very young. Married at 6, marriage consummated at 9.
Right. And for centuries, the traditional defense has been, this was the 7th century. Norms were different, maturity was defined by puberty, not a number, and it was a political alliance, common for the time.
But recently there's been a pushback, and not just from outside critics, but from within Islam, these revisionist theories.
Yes, and they use historical math. This is where it gets interesting. They look at Aisha's sister, Asma.
Asma argument.
Asma was 10 years older than Aisha. We know Asma died at age 100 in the year 73 after Hijra. If you do the math backward from that known date.
It places Aisha at around 18 or 19 at the time of her marriage's consummation.
A massive difference, 9 versus 19. They also use linguistic arguments that the word used to describe her. Jariya can mean young woman, not necessarily child.
So why isn't this the dominant view? It solves so many modern ethical discomforts.
Because it clashes directly with the text. The Bukhari Hadith explicitly says 6 and 9. So the tension is between the Sahih, the authentic, preserved text, and historical deduction. To accept the math, you have to say the text is wrong.
And for traditionalists, that's a very slippery slope.
A slippery slope they do not want to go down.
So what does this all mean? We've looked at privacy, politics, theology, lost verses, age. It's a lot.
It is. But if we synthesize it, what we really see is a spectrum of hermeneutics.
Break that down for us.
If you're Sunni, you look at Aisha and you trust in the collective integrity of the companions. If you're Shia, you view her through the filter of loyalty to the family. Her actions define her reliability. And if you're a critical or secular historian, you see these narrations as products of later political battles, projections of what people wanted her to be.
She becomes a canvas onto which all these anxieties and hopes are projected.
But she's also the gatekeeper. And that's the final thought I want to leave you with. Whether her voice was preserved perfectly, filtered through politics, or constructed by later generations, she remains the single most debated source of authority in Islamic history.
You literally cannot access the prophetic legacy without dealing with Aisha.
You have to grapple with her. She is standing at the door.
That is a powerful place to end. Aisha bint Abi Bakr, the lens of history. Thank you for diving deep with us today.
My pleasure.
And to our listener, what stands out to you? Is she the legal scholar correcting the men, the political leader making a controversial stand, or the young woman at the center of a historical storm? Mull on that. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.